Hello all. Welcome to the first of an 11-part long rewatch of the rightly revered classic 1981 Granada television adaptation of Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited, starring Jeremy Irons and Anthony Andrews and Diana Quick. Over the next 11 months I will be discussing each episode in depth, and we are starting at the beginning, as you would expect, with the double-length first episode, Et in Arcadia Ego. First, you have the opening titles, on a black background, which means we don't get to see any hint of actual Brideshead yet, which is absolutely proper. We just get the music, which is iconic. And for those of you like me who have rewatched this time and again over the years, that music is enough to instantly transport us. We open in the officer's barracks bedroom, panning across the sleeping figures, while Charles narrates.
Here, at the age of 39, I began to be old. As I lay in that dark hour, I was aghast to realize that something within me, long sickening, had quietly died. I felt as a husband might feel, who in the 4th year of his marriage suddenly knew he had no longer any desire or tenderness or esteem for a once beloved wife. We had been through it together, the army and I, from the first importunate courtship until now, when nothing remained to us except the chill bonds of law and duty and custom.
And we finally pan across to find Charles not sleeping at all, but just lying there motionless, with his eyes open, looking utterly hollow and broken. The metaphor of a marriage, in only the second line of the whole show, is of course foreshadowing for Charles's actual marriage. It's not foreshadowing from Charles's point of view, because it's already happened to him, but it's foreshadowing for the viewer. This is a man who, when he feels that he's most empty and hopeless, it reminds him of being married. Broken though he is resigned to doing his job, and we see over the next few scenes that he is functioning as an effective officer, respected by those around him. That stands out in contrast to the hapless Lieutenant Hooper, who does not inspire respect. Hooper's lack of competence makes it clear how competent Charles is. It also gives us our first glimpse of how much this is going to be a story about class. Charles's privileged background leaves him comfortable expecting servants to do their jobs, while Hooper is less comfortable with that. To a modern audience, this makes Charles feel very old-fashioned, and Hooper potentially more sympathetic. Charles's "I'm not surprised if you're so familiar with him" line is not one that necessarily lands well in the 21st century. That said, Charles comes across as a fairly sympathetic character. The two scenes with the regiment's CO, first with the ditch and then with the hair-cutting, demonstrate that he has a keen sense of what is fair and that he dislikes bullies. It is not that Charles necessarily stands up to bullies, of course, but he does strongly disapprove of them. Marching next to Hooper afterwards, he says, "It's not the sort of thing that used to happen in this regiment." That's not an especially helpful comment from Hooper's perspective. From Charles's point of view, though, it cuts to the heart of things. Charles likes the way things used to be, which will be something of a theme. Then they are on the train, with Charles still entirely indifferent to their destination. We see him walking down the swaying carriage, holding on to the backs of the seats for balance. More of that backwards foreshadowing. Charles may be thinking of an ocean liner, but the viewer hasn't got there yet. They arrive in darkness, having travelled through the night. When the sun has come up, Charles finally hears where they are.
It was as though someone had switched off the wireless, and a voice that had been bawling in my ears incessantly, fatuously, for days beyond number, had been suddenly cut short. An immense silence followed. Empty at first, but gradually filled with a multitude of sweet, natural and long-forgotten sounds. For he had spoken a name that was so familiar to me, a conjurer's name of such ancient power, that at its mere sound the phantoms of those haunted late years began to take flight.
This is when we finally get to see the house for the first time again. Because we've seen this before, haven't we? This is a rewatch. So it's not the first time, but it is the first time. Just like for Charles, this is not the first time. So now we get our initial flashback, and we slide back more than 20 years to Eights Week in Oxford, back when it was still a city of aquatints, and to Sebastian. We see Sebastian before we see the younger Charles. Into the college he wanders, teddy bear in hand. We also get to meet Lunt, Charles's scout, which harks back to the earlier conversation with Hooper about servants. Gentlemen who haven't got ladies are asked to eat out as far as possible, says Lunt. Will you be lunching in? No, Lunt, says Charles, with a quirk of a smile. Lunt then launches into a long diatribe against the ball and the dancing and the other changes that have come in with them back from the war. Lunt heartily disapproves of any changes to tradition. Charles sips his tea and ignores all of this. He is too young yet to realise that any change or modernity is bad. Sebastian arrives, and Charles immediately gulps down the last of his tea and gets up from the sofa. Sebastian is ever the extrovert, always performing. Charles is usually happy to be his adoring audience.
I said the whole of Oxford is becoming very peculiar suddenly. Last night it was pullulating with women. You want to come away with me at once, out of danger.
They drive off in a borrowed car. To see a friend, says Sebastian. They eat strawberries and drink wine under an elm tree. Sebastian stares off into the sky and talks about burying treasure everywhere he's ever felt happy, so that he can come back later and dig it up and remember. It sounds as if happiness to him is something rare and precious. We already get the sense that they are a couple, but not the sort that stares into each other's eyes. Charles tends to gaze almost exclusively at Sebastian, while Sebastian tends to gaze off into the distance. Now we get an earlier flashback for Charles to talk about his first meeting with Sebastian. But in less than 2 sentences, we are thrown even further back to his first arrival at Oxford. Flashbacks within flashbacks, as each memory triggers an earlier one. There is a long and very funny series of pieces of advice from Charles's cousin Jasper, all of which he is going to ignore. I watch this scene and marvel at how talented an actor Jeremy Irons is. His 18-year-old Charles is so different from his 39-year-old Charles. The hesitance, the eagerness. He looks younger in this scene even than he does in the scene 6 months later in Eight's Week. There is then the montage of his early sightings of Sebastian. Seeing him riding past in a horse-drawn cab, passing him at the barber's, seeing him misbehaving in a bar with Anthony Blanche. From the barber, we learn a little about him and his family. He is the Marquis of Marchmain's second boy. People find him amusing and charming. His brother, the Earl of Brideshead, had just finished his time at Oxford. He was very different. "Quite like an old man," says the barber. Every time I watch that scene, I am struck by how much this show has wormed its way into my head and onto my tongue for so many decades. Throughout my life, since probably my late 20s, so for the last 30 years, whenever I feel myself a bit puffed after getting up off a sofa or climbing a flight of stairs, or whenever I feel a twinge in my back, or just feel exhausted by something that didn't ought to have exhausted me, those are the words that I mutter to myself. "Quite like an old man," I say to myself, in precisely the tones of that Oxford barber, talking about Bridie before we've even met him. Quite like an old man. How absurd that such a trivial phrase should catch in my brain like a burr and be carried with me through a lifetime. It would never have happened, I suspect, if I had only seen the thing the once. This, then, is one of the perils of rewatching. It is not without its risks, apparently, our undertaking. Ah well, here we go again. And so, at last, Charles and Sebastian meet face to face. First at the window of his rooms, then properly in Sebastian's rooms the following day. Sebastian is sick on Charles's carpet that first time, and Lunt is initially very disgruntled about having to clean it up, although Sebastian's deluge of flowers soon charms him. Sebastian is good at charming people. It's already clear. His charm allows him to get away with things that from others would earn censure. As well as the flowers, there is an invitation to lunch, which Charles goes to.
I went there uncertainly, for it was foreign ground, and there was a tiny, priggish, warning voice in my ear which, in the tones of Collins, told me it was seemly to hold back. But I was in search of love in those days, and I went full of curiosity and the faint, unrecognized apprehension that here at last I should find that low door in the wall others I knew had found before me, which opened on an enclosed and enchanted garden which was somewhere, not overlooked by any window, in the heart of that grey city.
And so there is lunch at Sebastian's, along with Boy Mulcaster and half a dozen others. Anthony Blanche arrives late enough to make a proper entrance and doesn't waste the opportunity. Antoine serves an important purpose narratively, by being such an over-the-top attention whore that he makes Sebastian look positively polite by comparison. The main focus of this scene is the instant attraction between Charles and Sebastian, but around that central theme there circles a mess of foreshadowing. Lady Marchmain gets her first mention, and that she lives at Brideshead. "They always lay early for her," says Sebastian about the plover's eggs. When Antoine is declaiming The Wasteland from the balcony, the lines are from a scene of attempted seduction. "Flushed and decided, he assaults at once," reminded me of Charles on the Atlantic liner, remembering the patterns of earlier seductions and how different things are with Julia. The mood and tone of Sebastian Friends feels so different than what we have seen of Colin's and Charles's little group. They all chatter away to each other cheerfully, and there is a richness to the scene that goes beyond a lobster thermidor and champagne. Charles can't immediately adjust to it. "Don't look so serious," says Sebastian. When the party breaks up, Charles starts to leave, still finding it seemly to hold back. But Sebastian offers him more Cointreau, and then takes him to the botanical gardens. Charles had arrived, musing about a secret garden, and we see the two of them, arm in arm, passing through a gate in the railings, which they close behind them, leaving us outside. When Charles comes back to his rooms, he is already sufficiently changed that the pictures that he once liked no longer please him. Pictures of flowers are a poor reflection of the real flowers around him. We've already seen Charles sketching in the lecture hall, so his interest in and aptitude for art are already established. In any case, as viewers, we have already been told that, before the war and the army, he would make his living as an artist. The flashback within a flashback ends, and we are back to the following year, and the two of them sipping wine beneath the elm trees, and then driving onwards to Charles's first sight of Brideshead Castle. "What a place to live in," says Charles. "It's where my family live," counters Sebastian. They go in through a side entrance more suited to servants than the highborn, and Sebastian takes Charles up narrow stone staircases to meet Nanny Hawkins. She tells them that Julia is also here for the day, and will be back for tea, which forces Sebastian to be more obvious than he might have been about wanting to keep Charles from meeting his family. There's a moment of tension about this, but once Sebastian comes clean and lets Charles in, it's quickly resolved.
I must go quickly before my sister gets back.
Who are you ashamed of, her or me?
I'm ashamed of myself. I'm not going to let you get mixed up with my family. They're so madly charming. All my life they've been taking things away from me. If they once got hold of you with their charm, they make you their friend and not mine, and I won't let them.
All right. I'm perfectly content.
Sebastian wants to leave immediately after chatting with Nanny Hawkins, but Charles persuades him to show him a few bits of the house. Sebastian's line of, "It's all like this, you see, nothing to see," is funny, of course, but there's more to it than simple obliviousness. He is quite aware that Charles will have his head turned by it all, and that is absolutely part of what he is afraid of. He does show Charles the chapel, and there's the moment when Charles kneels briefly, uncertain of what good manners are in this unfamiliar space, and Sebastian's, "Well, you needn't on my account," has a bitterness to it. The chapel is clearly important to Sebastian. He wants Charles to be impressed by it, and is pleased when he is. "Papa had it restored for Mamma," he says, "as a wedding present." They pass Julia on the drive, giving Charles his first fleeting glimpse of her, and they are away. The viewer is kept in the same state of anticipation as Charles is. We are given a full shot of Julia entering the house, but only from behind. We are not allowed yet to see her face. "I'm sorry," says Sebastian as they drive back to Oxford. "I'm afraid I wasn't very nice this afternoon. Brideshead often has that effect on me." He doesn't say, "My family often has that effect on me," but they then go on to talk about family.
I don't keep asking you questions about your family.
Neither do I about yours.
But you look so inquisitive.
You're so mysterious about them.
I'd hoped I was mysterious about everything.
I love the delivery of that last line. Sebastian's honesty about how much of a performance he puts on is certainly part of his charm. The delivery of the next few lines is equally marvellous. Once again, Jeremy Irons has 18-year-old Charles sound very like a teenager. His 39-year-old version of the character would have delivered these lines very differently.
Perhaps I am rather curious about people's families. Because it's not a thing I know much about. There's only my father and myself. An aunt used to keep an eye on me, but my father drove her abroad.
You don't know what you've been saved. There are lots of us. Look them up into Brett.
Then there is a montage of summertime scenes by the river, narrated over by Charles.
I had lived a lonely childhood and a boyhood straitened by war and overshadowed by bereavement. To the hard bachelordom of English adolescence, the premature dignity and authority of the school system, I had added a sad and grim strain of my own. Now, that summer term with Sebastian, it seemed as though I was being given a brief spell of what I had never known, a happy childhood. And though its toys were silk shirts and liqueurs and cigars, and its naughtiness high in the catalogue of grave sins, there was something of a nursery freshness about us that fell little short of the joy of innocence.
There are two threads in that narration that I want to pull on. The first is what an isolated childhood Charles had, so bereft of emotional contact or affection. Charles is not good at doing emotions. We will return to this again and again through the story. I think it would be very possible to view his character through the lens of the autistic spectrum. He does consistently find it seemly to hold back. He's a cold fish. The second thread is that line about their naughtiness being high in the catalogue of grave sins. This adaptation stays true to the novel, in that it implies that Charles and Sebastian are a gay couple without explicitly stating it. There are no explicit sex scenes between them, and we never see them so much as making out. I think viewers were expected to think of them as gay, but that viewers who might have had a problem with that back in the 1980s were allowed to remain oblivious if they so chose. I was in my early teens when this first came out. I watched the first few episodes sitting with my parents in the front room, and in my innocence I completely missed all the gay undertones, or at least I was not consciously aware of them. A little while later, though, I overheard my mother discussing it with a friend. "So, do you think they're, asked one of them. "Well, if they aren't yet," said the other, "they're going to be." My eyes were opened. I was at a boys' independent school at the time, albeit a day school and not a boarding school where Charles would have been at that age. Gay was certainly a word I knew, but really only pejoratively. The depiction of Charles and Sebastian was my first exposure to an even partially positive representation of gay love. One way or another, whichever way you read it, this is definitely a love story. When Charles talks about cramming himself with neglected texts to pass his exams, he says,
Texts. I remember no syllable of them now, but the other, more ancient love, which I acquired that term, will be with me in one shape or another till my last hour.
And when cousin Jasper attempts an intervention, Charles rebuffs him and thinks afterwards,
So my cousin Jasper despaired. Looking back, There is little I would have left undone, or done otherwise. Perhaps now I could match my cousin Jasper's gamecock maturity with a sturdier fowl. I could tell him that to know and love one other human being is the root of all wisdom.
The highlight for me of Cousin Jasper's grand remonstrance is the moment when Charles, having rebuffed him, invites him to stay for a glass of champagne. And Jasper's response, still in the thick of his exams, is, "No, thank you, I have Greek history and morals on Monday." That line, Greek history and morals, is not Wars. It is not there in the original novel, and is therefore probably the creation of John Mortimer, who wrote the original screenplay for this adaptation. I say probably because some sources have it that large chunks of Mortimer's screenplay were never used. There was a long gap before filming even started, due to industrial action, and the producer and the director spent those many months kicking the project around, restructuring it and expanding its scope and running time. Then there is a dinner with Antoine, when he does his best to stir up trouble between Charles and Sebastian. The key theme that he harps on, and which he will return to much later, is that Sebastian's greatest gift is his charm, and that it is beautiful but as insubstantial as a soap bubble. We also find out more from Antoine about Sebastian's family, about his father's affair, his parents' separation, his mother's piety. He also makes various claims about Sebastian's time at Eton. Those are probably mostly exaggerations or outright lies, although the line, "Boy Mulcaster was positively scrofulous," never fails to make me laugh. Antoine, awful as he sometimes is also prophetic about many things. It is he, at this dinner, who insists that Charles is an artist. He also correctly predicts precisely how Sebastian will later react to hearing about the evening, so that even his lies end up ringing a little bit true. Next comes the long vac, and Charles is initially marooned, penniless at home in London, engaged in psychological warfare with his father, a marvellous comic turn by Sir John Gielgud. When I heard the line, "Let us say you are in Queer Street and leave it at that," I wondered if that too was an addition of John Mortimer's adaptation. But no, it is right there in Waugh's original novel. A bit of poking around online suggests that queer as a slang term for homosexuality had been in common use for 30 years by the time this book was written. Charles escapes from London when the slightly injured Sebastian summons him to Brideshead. He has broken a bone in his foot so tiny that it doesn't even have a name, but he has been told to keep it up for a month and is confined to a wheelchair. There, in the yard of Melton Carberry Station, Charles sees Julia properly for the first time. She drives him to the house, chatting with him happily. The only real foreshadowing here is the moment when he lights a cigarette for her.
It was the first time in my life that anyone had asked this of me, and as I took the cigarette from my lips and put it in hers, I caught a thin bat squeak of sexuality, inaudible to any but me.
Julia is 18 at this point, having just come out for her first season in London. She is a year or two younger than Charles or Sebastian, although Charles's rather hesitant nature makes her come across as more mature. One of the only slight problems with the casting of this adaptation is that Sebastian and Julia are supposed to be very, very similar in looks, and Anthony Andrews and Diana Quick really aren't. I adore them both, and I would not change either one of them, but it does require a certain suspension of disbelief. Remembering that car journey, Charles says that she so much resembled Sebastian that sitting beside her I was confused by the double illusion of familiarity and strangeness. Later, after the three of them have had dinner, Sebastian is alone with Charles, and they briefly discuss Julia.
My sister's very pompous tonight.
I don't think she cares for me.
I don't think she cares for anyone very much. I love her. She's so like me.
Do you? Is she?
In looks, I mean, in the way she talks. I wouldn't love anyone with a character like mine.
Julia leaves the following morning, and Charles and Sebastian are left alone, which is to say, just them and the small army of servants who run the house. The episode closes with Charles pushing Sebastian's chair through the hothouse, surrounded by the lush greenery, in an echo of the earlier moment that we saw in Oxford's Botanical Gardens.
I believed myself very close to heaven during those languid days at Brideshead. It is thus I like to remember Sebastian, as he was that summer, when we wandered alone through that enchanted palace.
So that's the end of the first episode of this rewatch. The first and last episodes of the adaptation are double length, so I'm expecting most of these videos to be shorter than this one. Thanks for joining me. Do drop a comment below and let me know you're out there. I'm fine with watching this all on my own, as I have so many times before, but it's always nice to have company. Bye for now.